So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. And we are continuing our study of the Hassidic masters and of the whole Hassidic world. For the last few weeks, we were talking about the Maggid of Mezeritch, Baal of Mezeritch, and his stories and his teachings about how to live. And now we're switching. Right. This is last week.
Last week.
That's what Sheila,
That's what Sheila gave.
that's what she
Okay.
gave me.
Let's
Maybe
see.
we'll ever make some more.
No, let me find a different copy to give.
No.
Maybe I sent the wrong one. Okay. It doesn't actually matter. We can do it without a copy
Okay.
today. So we're gonna be talking about something else, and I just a quick note. I have to go at 10:30 and spend 5 minutes to say hello to the preschool Purim celebration, then I'll come back. But I have a little video I'm gonna show
Me
in the
too.
meantime.
Yeah, you wanna wear his wig?
And then
No,
I
that's
brought-
for me.
I brought a costume.
That's
too.
for me,
Okay.
because I'm going too.
But so we're gonna start to talk really about all the disciples of the Maggid of Mezeritch, because he had a group we've been talking about of students who really carried on his work and the message. They're saying they used to come to him in Mezeritch, and then eventually, especially when he died, they went out throughout all of Europe and just had this carried with them his way of life and his spiritual power and affected a lot of people. And there was a whole group of them. There was Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, who was I always on every Kol Nidre I share a story about him. He's the one who says, who stopped prayer at a certain point, and this is the prayer where you hit your chest and you say, I sinned for this, I sinned for that. And one year he turned to heavens and he said, God, if we didn't sin so much, where would you hear such beautiful music? And so there's a lot of a lot of these were really big characters who had beautiful ways of approaching God, and they're the ones who launched it, who really launched the whole Hassidic endeavor, which hundreds of years later, there's a Hasidim who are wearing full-on Hasidic garb, but even the rest of the Jewish world has been profoundly affected by their spiritual approach and spirit and their stories. And so I'm going to talk about two brothers who ended up being followers of the Maggid of Mezeritch, Reb Zusya and Reb Elimelech of Lizinsk. And they're the ones who, you ever heard me tell the story of the two Hasidim who did Shabbat on a Tuesday? These are the two ones who did. I shared at Kala this year. I'll talk about it later today. Before we begin, I actually want to first just quickly check and see if I can send Sheila a different paper, yeah, because this is the one from last week. Let's see.
It is?
And
yeah.
I'll go tell her to keep her eye out. Sure.
Okay,
An email.
yeah. It might be on my laptop, which means I'll have to go upstairs to do that. So I could do that halfway through. Let's see. Okay. Never mind. Let's see.
That's mine, yeah.
I didn't go very far just in case.
Give me 1 second. Yeah, somehow it didn't attach it. That's right. Okay, never mind. I'll go do it myself I'll take a few minutes before I go to the preschool and we'll do it. So I'm going to talk about Reb Zusya. And Reb Zusya, of these two, there were these two brothers. And one of them was Reb Elimelech of Lizinsk, and the other Reb Zusya of Hanipol. And there were two brothers. Spent a lot of time together, and they'd become two of the great leaders after the Maggid. And Reb Elimelech, he was known because he started a new way of thinking about the Hasidim. He developed a theology of the tzaddik, right? A big Rebbe who was a tzaddik and who would end up carrying all of and right now, if you think about all the Hasidic dynasties, they all have these Rebbes. And these Rebbes, people turn to them for everything. The Rebbe prays to them to help them gives them prayers to help their physical things, for their parnasa, right? Their livelihood, that helps pray, to help them have children, prays to them for everything. And it was Rebbe Zusya who developed that theology. But Reb Zusya, he wasn't known for much he did or much he said. There's kind of stories about who he was, but he has one saying, which is one of the most beautiful sayings, where he proclaimed, "In the world to come, they're not going to ask me, why weren't you more like Moses? They'll ask me, why weren't you more like Reb Zusya? Why weren't you more like yourself?" Which is a big, and this became a really big idea in Hasidism. That's all about authenticity, about being true to yourself and honest and being who you are. And this
Psychology,
it's really
right?
good psychology, right? And it's really good spiritual approach too, because it means that your whole spiritual path became about being like, be yourself and remove all the influence of other people. And even, they get to remove the influence of where you come from, of your parents, and then this, like, you decide who you are. You choose your life approach in a completely authentic way. And that we all have our particular challenges are true to ourselves, and we have to live those. And so he really lived that. And he was always searching for truth, Reb Zusya. He was always trying to, in every moment. So there's all these stories about him. There's a story that at one point he looked down at the earth and he said, "Earth, earth, you are better than I, and yet I trample on you with my feet, but soon I shall come under and be subject to you." This is kind of like just using the world around him in the sense of searching for truth. Like, what does it mean to be alive? Well, to be alive, it's not going to last forever. Soon you're going to be underneath this earth. And so this kind of sense of talking to the earth and to everything. And he really would, in some ways, he exemplified almost more than all the teachings we've been reading about, right? We talked about, David was mentioning this last time, Dov Bear, who said, you have to live as if God is surrounding you at all times, and these pipelines of spiritual blessing are coming into your life. And he really lived that. He tried to believe in everything was not tried. He believed that everything was complete sincerity. And so there's a story that once Zusya prayed to God and he said, "Lord, I love you so much, but I don't fear you enough. I love you so much, but I don't fear you enough." So he said, let me stand in awe of you. He's like, who are, let me stand in awe of you, just like we see the angels stand in awe of you. And then it says that God heard his prayer, and God's name suddenly penetrated Zusya's heart, as it does the angels. And Zusya went running and crawled under his bed, saying, "No, no, no, God, stop. Let me love you like I did before. Let me love you like Zusya again." But he had like this almost childlike relationship with God. There's many traditions that have kind of special figures who had that kind of relationship. He had this complete sincerity, right, of talking to God in that sincere and really real way.
So fear wasn't necessarily a bad thing there.
Yeah, fear is not necessary, because he wanted to know, God, what are you really like? What are you? I want to, people. Why do we have awe of God? Because of the majesty of God, right? The awe of God, and so, I think, I love this in the movie The Ten Commandments. It's on my mind because my costume is a little bit but the movie of the Ten Commandments, you see Charlton Heston before the burning bush and after the burning bush, right? And after the burning bush, his hair is like, shoo, and gone away. Because to meet God, right? You meet God, it's not a small thing, right? It changes your life. And so it's sometimes, when people say, this is a big thing, when people say I'm hearing God's voice, for me, how do you feel if it's real or not? If you can feel that it's changed your life, it's like, oh, I just heard God's voice, like it was like and I'm like, okay, well, maybe you had something that happened spiritually but to really hear an encounter with the divine, it changes you forever, right? That's a real encounter with the divine. And that's, so, I once, not to make too much of a point of this, but I once gave a talk somewhere, and someone said to me, "Oh, I belong to this." They weren't Jewish, but they belonged to this church, and we're able to. And whoever launches a church, we channel Krishna, we channel God of the Jews, and we channel this, we channel that, and he said it in such a kind of like, like it was no big deal. I thought, well, from my point of view, if you really speak to any of these things, it's going to blow your mind away. It's not just I went for a walk in the park and started talking to so anyway, in this story, I mean, there's a story actually like that too in the Eastern tradition, the Bhagavad Gita, where the person who's the main speaker talks to Krishna, right, who's symbolic of God in the Bhagavad Gita, and says, let me see you in your true form. And suddenly sees God in the true form and is like, whoo, please don't show yourself to me like this anymore. So the sense of the power of that, which you think you get from this story, and that Zusya was very experiential for him. He wasn't so much in the mind saying, you should do this. It was very powerful experience. But there was, and so there's a great story about him, where one of his later followers or people who really loved Reb Zusya was trying to explain why we don't have so many teachings about Reb Zusya. All the other Hasidic leaders, we have these books that are authored by them. Berdichev and the Maggid had a few, and the Baal Shem Tov has all these teachings that were collected by others. And they say that so he said there was a story that when Reb Zusya used to hear deathbed of Maggid of Mezeritch, whenever he would say a quote from scripture, as it said, and God spoke, which if you listen to Torah reading, it's all the time, right? And God spoke to Moses. Whenever you're hearing God spoke, he would be so overwhelmed by the thought of God actually speaking that he would cry out loud, and God spoke, and go into some kind of ecstatic state. He just could, it was so powerful, and he missed the rest of the teaching. So he wasn't there often when the kind of the philosophic teachings were around, because he was in this deep spiritual state, because he was just an incredible, sincere soul who really experienced it. I mean, this thing was real. But I think where I want to take this, before I go for the thing at 10:30, is that he wasn't just, like a holy simpleton who just walked around in these states. He had tremendous spiritual power. And I've shared this story before on Rosh Hashanah, and I think it shows kind of some of his greatness and his spiritual greatness, this story. Now, this is a story about someone who would eventually have what is Charles's job in our synagogue, who would become the Torah reader. Hello, Yakira. Yakira.
He's on.
Oh,
Hello.
This is
hello.
Isan.
Okay, how you doing?
Hi. That's the rabbi.
Hello.
She met me.
She met
Oh, okay.
Laura.
Wow.
That's the rabbi.
I told her the story of Purim. She did.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome.
That's Ellen.
She's gonna teach.
Oh, okay.
I've known Diane and Jack.
Jay.
Jack. I'm gonna be a teacher's assistant.
Okay.
You'll love it.
Oh.
Thank you for joining us. We're glad you're here.
Have a good day.
You too.
You do. She's learning all the Jewish things. She said,
She
so
is.
I told her about Purim.
Wonderful. And then she looks so much like Akira. It's like Akira was telling me she wanted to come today. So
She would.
okay. So I want to share this. I've shared the story at Rosh Hashanah before, but it's a story about the reader, the person who become the Torah reader for the congregation where Reb Zusya was the Rebbe. And so he heard a lot about Reb Zusya. There was this guy who had an incredible relationship with God, so he decided to go to the house of study and to hear the Rebbe talk. And so when he arrived there, he looked in through the window, and there he saw Reb Zusya. And Reb Zusya was wearing his talit, his prayer shawl. He was reciting the Psalm, Anani, answer me when I call, answer me when I call. And then he started weeping, and you've never seen anybody weep this loud. And he looked down, and on the floor there was a man lying next to the Rebbe, and the man was just moaning and suddenly crying out, I am a great sinner, I am a great sinner. And he kept repeating this over and over and flailing his arms. And then suddenly when the man stopped screaming and moaning, he saw Reb Zusya bend down and lift the man up and turn his head around to face him. And then he looked at him directly in his face, and he said, your iniquity is taken away and all your sins are atoned for. And suddenly the man walked away like a new man. And so later he had a private meeting with the Rebbe, and he learned the whole story. And he said that this man, Reb Zusya said, was an assistant in another Hasid study in a nearby town, and he'd committed this horrible sin. And the rabbi there didn't know what to do with him, so he sent him to Reb Zusya. And he told him Reb Zusya could help him do penance. So what did Reb Zusya do? He said, Reb Zusya said, I climbed down all the rungs until I was with him, and I bound my soul to his, in that most terrible place where he was. And then I had no choice but to do penance. He had no choice but to do penance with me. And he said, I'm going to be stuck where you are unless you do penance with me. And then so together they did penance together. He went to the place where he was in the depths of his suffering and bound himself to him at that place. And then together they started doing the penance. And he said, what a difficult and terrible penance it was. And then when I raised him up off the floor, his soul was pure like the day he was born. And he went through all that terrible, clearing away all that mishigas completely with him. And then the guy said, when I heard these words from the Rebbe, I understood the magnitude of Rebbe Zusya's spiritual power and the depth of his love for those who came to him. And then I decided I wanted to be the reader in this Hasid prayer. So it's not that far from the story that we heard the other day, about the Baal Shem Tov and Maggid, but being completely moved by the story of the spiritual power of him. And there's all these other stories about him. That he would do this for other people. He would go there and be with them in the absolute depths of their pain and their suffering, and people felt that he would take on their suffering. There was like a spiritual shift. He would take on their sin for them. That's how how he would go to that place with them. And so we'll talk more about this afterwards. But he embraced that role really strongly. And so he wasn't just a simpleton, but he's someone who connected to people in a way. The Baal Shem Tov did too, and Maggid maybe too, but it was really a Baal Shem Tov thing. But the people felt, one of the reasons the Hasidism spread so much is that people felt that these people were with them. They weren't in some ivory tower where like some of the Talmudic rabbis, but they were with them and in the most sharing in every ounce of their pain and being with them until that pain was cleared. And so that's part of where his brother then started this whole theology. That was the actual role. And it wasn't to put them on some pedestal. They had these spiritual powers, but that the Rebbe had to take on some of that. And you read that in the book, The Chosen, there's some of that that's described. And when that role of Rebbe became hereditary, maybe it lost a lot of that power, because initially it wasn't about, hereditary, you have the power, but only those who did have the power to connect to people in that way were able to be those figures.
No,
Go ahead.
we'll save it till after.
So at 10:30, I'm going to put on the video now, as I go do this. But at 10:30, there's actually a worldwide thing of saying the Shema for the hostages. So when it hits 10:30, if you want to say the Shema, then you could say it. And I'm actually going to play the same video that you saw last time, but just a section where the Rabbi Soloway is at the grave of the Maggid of Mezeritch, which is also where Reb Zusya is buried. So you're going to see him talk about the Reb Zusya and the Maggid, and go back to that scene and you'll see the grave of Reb Zusya. So I encourage you to then say the Shema at 10:30.
Okay.
If anybody wants to put the pause on it, then you can just come here and do it. But the video is about, and then he talks about, let's see.
Call your doorbell camera company and cancel the subscription. This brand new subscription.
So, 1 second. Jay, do you mind sitting here and just, if you get to, if there's ads that come up, can you see through the ads and, okay. You look great.
Thank you.
Okay.
You don't think you're gonna scare somebody?
Better than my cowboy part.
I'll be back.
That wig is great.
So here in this ohel, in this room that's been created, we have two very important Hasidim here. These two guys. This is the Maggid of Mezeritch. It says, Po niftar, here lies Harav HaMaggid Mezeritch, Rabbeinu Dov ben Rabbi Avraham. And the Maggid of Mezeritch was really the figure who, according to the legends, really took all of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings. He was his primary student and he helped to disseminate them. And he had many, many Hasidim who each went off and interpreted Hassidism in their own way and created all the different dynasties and lineages of Hasidim. But the Maggid of Mezeritch was really the primary disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. And an important student of his was this guy, Reb Zusya of Hanipol, who was quite a character from the stories and a very zealous, pious kind of soul who was just always bursting into tears at the wonder of it all. There's a beautiful story about how the Maggid of Mezeritch first became a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. He was a very learned man, very versed in all of the rabbinic texts. There's, you know, the Talmud and also Kabbalah and the Zohar and everything. And he'd heard all of these rumors about this great man, the Baal Shem Tov, and wanted to kind of check him out. So he went to Mezhibozh and booked a room in an inn and really went straight to the Baal Shem Tov and just sort of greeted him, hardly looked at his face and just waited for the Baal Shem Tov to start teaching and talking, and he would know whether he was the real thing or whether it was all just made up stories. And the Baal Shem Tov, after a moment silent, just says, you know, once I was on a very, very long journey and I had no bread to feed my coachman. And then suddenly on the way there was a peasant who gave us bread for the coachman. And then he stopped talking. And the Maggid of Mezeritch just went back to the inn and was like, what was that all about? Didn't get anything from that teaching and was frustrated, and all these stories and the long journey he'd made to visit this great man and wasn't getting it. And so the next night he went again into the presence of the Baal Shem Tov, and the similar thing happened. The Baal Shem Tov looked at him and he said, you know, once while I was traveling on the road, I had no hay to feed my horses. And then as we were going along on our way, a farmer stopped us and gave hay to the horses. And then he bid the Maggid of Mezeritch, it wasn't the Maggid of Mezeritch yet, he was the Rab Dovber, greeted him good night, and that was enough. That was enough. Reb Dovber said, you know what, this is crazy, all of these stories about this man, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He told his coachman to get the horses ready. He was going to leave town that night. He was going to wait until the moon scattered the clouds in the sky and they were going to set off under the full moon. And as soon as the moon came into the sky, a messenger came from the Baal Shem Tov and said, my master wants to see you. And so Reb Dovber went into the presence of the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov to him said, so you know a little bit of Kabbalah? You know some of the secrets? And Reb Dovber said, yeah, I know Kabbalah. So he said, open this book. And he handed him a book called Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life. And he said, read it. And he started reading it. And he said, now think. And he stopped and he thought. And he said, now explain, expound, explicate what you're reading. And it was a passage all about the secrets of the angels, and the Maggid of Mezeritch started explaining it. And the Baal Shem Tov looked at him and said, you know, everything you said is right. You don't have any real knowledge at all because you're not really feeling it. Sit down and listen. And the Baal Shem Tov started explaining the same text that Reb Dovber had just read, and suddenly the whole room was consumed in fire. Fire came down, and then the Reb Dovber heard the voices of angels filling the room and filling his head, and he was in such a frenzy he passed out. And then when he
You can talk to people, I don't know.
Okay, I just, we're stopping the video for a minute. As the rabbi explained, it's Ta'anit Esther, the fast of Esther, and there's a a movement, I don't know how it got organized, that at 10:30, and I don't know if that, I assume it's just 10:30 and wherever you happen to be.
Right.
We're gonna say the Shema in unity with the hostages and in support of trying to bring them home. So, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Okay,
We did the Shema.
you did the Shema, oh, that's what I should have done over there. Okay, thank you.
And here's the paper, but
Oh, yeah, clean and everything, we didn't even get to see it.
And he said, who are you dressed as, Jesus?
who's that? That's funny. Well, it was similar, right?
It was. I said it was the only costume I had in my closet that was easy to.
And like the penance thing reminds me of Catholicism also, you know, going to
Yeah.
the priest and getting
Getting
something to say,
getting
to
removed.
relieve your sins.
I mean, it goes back to the temple and the sacrifices, right? It's the origin of biblical, and I mean, think about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, what are we doing? We're trying to get rid of all of our stuff. And so, did you watch?
Can I say something about what you were talking about earlier, Rabbi?
Yeah, go for it.
When I was a youngster, sometimes what would happen is people secretly would put firecrackers around our feet, some of our friends, and they'd light the firecrackers off and notice what our response was. If we seemed startled, we were shamed, okay, to be startled by that. Now, if you think of the experiences of being, let's say, God talking to you, or of the angels coming to you, you have to train yourself not to be startled by that stuff, or the experiences are not going to happen. If you're frightened by that, if you're going to be overthrown by that, if you're going to lose your mind from that, then these experiences won't happen to you. So in order to be, you have to train yourself to be open-minded, just like we did when I was a youngster with the firecrackers, a sudden noise, okay, and that you didn't know was coming. You had to be able to flow with it. You had to be able to go with it. So the business of being overwhelmed by some spiritual experience means essentially that you're not going to have these spiritual experiences, or they're going to sort of tear you apart.
I actually disagree with that. I think that the Reb Zusya, in his case, it was the magnitude of his spiritual experiences was greater. You know, of course, he was having spiritual experiences all the time, but that, you know, God was revealing God's self to Zusya, because God, after all, if God is God and the universal consciousness really talks to you, when God maybe gives spiritual experiences to people, God gives a drop, but of course God is able to open the faucet, so to speak, and give a much greater magnitude. And so what Reb Zusya was really saying is, I want to experience the full magnitude of your being. And so I don't think he was getting overwhelmed because he didn't have the vessel to contain God's, but because he was constantly in such a place of spiritual experience. And so, you know, I think that
Well, but you don't have to contain it. Okay, we're not talking about containing it. There's no possibility of containing it. You have to let it be. You have to let it, so to speak, flow through you. If it flows through you, you don't have to contain it. You don't have to be torn apart by it.
I agree with you, but I'm saying there's spiritual experiences of different magnitudes. And so when you read of the great spiritual experiences of any religion, you see that the people all experiencing them were completely in awe. And those are different than the kind
Well,
of
in awe is fine. In awe is fine because of course you're in awe, but you're not buffeted by the thing dramatically because you're not, in fact, because you're not trying to contain it, you're not trying to understand it. Because you know that there is in fact no formal understanding of this. The rational mind cannot grasp these things. So if the rational mind can't grasp it, it just is what it is.
So you're
I-
saying we
I-
shouldn't be we shouldn't be terrified of these experiences. We should
I'm
feel
saying-
lucky.
I totally agree with you that that should be your intention. But if you read through any of the prophets or any of the great experiences, it's one thing to say it, and I don't think it's like suddenly when you read of people who take anyway, it doesn't matter. These are experiences that are so overwhelming. You know, you read of Ezekiel, you read of Isaiah, all the prophets, when they're called to prophecy, have the same experience. It's not that they're not prepared for it, but it's that the magnitude, the sensory, and I think, you know, once even the prophets, once someone has reached a state of full realization of spiritual enlightenment, then there's no more. Those experiences maybe are less humbling, but I think while there's still a trace of personality left, then if one is not overwhelmed by an experience, and I think there's still bigger experiences to come that a person did not experience spiritually, because you know that, and I think it's different, and I think it is different when God reveals God's self to the in a way that does that shakes every element. And of course, one doesn't want to be scared, and sometimes one isn't. But what I think the story of Reb Zusya and the story of Arjuna, that's what it is in the Bhagavad Gita shows, is that the experience of when God truly reveals God's self and the thing of it, and that's, you know, you can have spent 20 years meditating, you could have spent gone through many other kinds of experiences of a lesser degree, but to have that kind of experience is kind of, even if you've been preparing your whole life, you're still going to be in awe. And maybe you won't be
in awe for sure. In awe for sure. Awe is allowed.
But if God wants you to be terrified, God will make sure you're terrified. Because God can show things that it's going to be. I just don't.
Like 12 years in the cave.
Yeah, I mean, look, Reb Zusya was the as high as they come, and I think in terms of being overwhelmed by this thought of when God spoke, he was in divine ecstasy. He wasn't that he was a novice, unprepared for this is I remember reading about this. There's certain spiritual figures who just their spiritual lives are so alive, and the visions they're having constantly, they're just, and on one hand, they're not the type for letting it filter through who they are, but it's happening in such a way, and it's hard for people to understand it. But when people often come close to these figures and catch a little bit of what they're going through, and they get a sense of what they're going through, then they suddenly understand that their regular spiritual life is just, happening in a overall a kind of normal way, and that there's a whole level of magnitude that they just weren't. And so I think that with Reb Zusya, he was one of those people who had such a powerful spiritual life. There was and there's a story actually I wasn't going to tell because I don't remember the details. There's a great story about him where the Vilna, the Vilna of Gaon, right, who was one of the greatest Talmudic authority of his day, one was hearing all about the Hasidim, and he was very, very anti them, and his criticism of them is they were ignoramuses, and so he had someone who was going to go compare to his Talmudic and overall learning, And he said, he sent one of his people to go to Reb Zusya and ask him an obscure question. I can't remember what it was exactly, that's why I didn't bring the story. But it was something about when you bury a person and what you bury with them. And so the person went to ask Reb Zusya, and Reb Zusya gave him an answer, and the guy came back, and this is the day before, you can look it up online, right? And so he came back and he told the Vilna Gaon the answer, and the Vilna Gaon was really surprised. It was such a minute little detail. Like, how could Reb Zusya know this? How could he have that type of learning? I heard he didn't know that much. And so he sent him back, and he went and they asked Reb Zusya, where did he learn? He says, well, I got it from the same place that Talmud got it from.
He went to the source.
He went to the source. Kind of another beautiful story about him. But I wanted to go back a little bit to some of the stories about how he would work with people to be willing to take on this specific idea of taking on people's karma, taking on their balance sheets of their spiritual sins, so to speak. So there's a story, another very intense story. All the stories of Reb Zusya are very intense. He was going from village to village. He was to collect funds for redeeming the captives, because it's not just right now there are captives, but back then there were a lot of captives. And he was, and then he came to an inn to ask people for donations. When he got to the place, he saw that there was a bird. It's actually a different story I want to tell too, but he saw there was a bird in the cage, and he opened up and he saw the bird, and he said, how can I go ahead and play for the release of hostages if I'm not also helping all beings be free? So he went ahead and opened up the cage, and the bird went free, and the owner of the inn saw it and gave him a beating for releasing and he said, and so this is part of who Reb Zusya was. Reb Zusya was about freeing people, whether they were in metal cages or flesh and blood cages, but in helping people become perfectly free. And another story about him is he once went to an inn with Elimelech of Lizinsk, and they were, it was an inn that was, I guess, not in the Jewish area, and there was a big wedding happening there, and the people who were the party were very rambunctious and not friendly to Jewish people. And so as they were dancing and saying, we need to have a little added element to our celebration, and grab one of these folks. So they grabbed Reb Zusya and started passing around, giving me a beating. And they went from place to place and they gave him a beating, and suddenly they put him back in his chair. And his brother Elimelech said, you know what, you've gotten too much, let's exchange chairs. And they looked a lot alike. And so I'll be in the front chair and you be in the back chair so they don't get you. And so I get the next one. And so a little bit later in the evening, the people came and they picked up Rebbe Elimelech, and they was about to give him a beating because it was now his turn. Say, wait a second, we've already given this one a beating. It's time to make it fair. Let's go back to the other one. And so they gave Reb Zusya the beating again. And they said Reb Zusya was getting the beating again. He laughed out loud to his brother and said, if blows are meant to come your way, they're going to come your way anyway. They're going to come your way anyway they come. And so there's so he too should carry a souvenir of the wedding, right? That was the story. So and Reb Zusya felt, or his followers felt, that why did these things happen to him? Because he was taking on other people's bad qualities, and all these things would happen, and he was willing to go to the depths and carry other people's stuff for them. And which is, think about how many people would be willing to do that, not too many, right? So but he was always going out of his way. So I finish with the story of Rebbe Elimelech and Lizinsk, and then we're going to study this to give a little taste of Reb Zusya, and that's how the way the Hasidim and him and the way they were thinking didn't come out of nowhere, but was coming out of Judaism that existed and out of the Talmud. And they just really lived some of the concepts in a very powerful way. So some of you heard me told this story, but that Reb Zusya, Reb Elimelech, when they were in their earlier years, they just loved doing Shabbat so much. Every day, waited all week for Shabbat, like many Jews, especially when the times were bad. And when Shabbat came, they just loved every part of Shabbat so much. And so one week, after the end of Shabbat, they said, what's the biggest problem about Shabbat? Is at the end of Shabbat, you have to wait another 6 days until Shabbat begins again. And so Reb Zusya said to Reb Elimelech, what if we do Shabbat on a Tuesday? And so, Reb Elimelech said, how can you do Shabbat on a Tuesday? It makes no sense. You do, it says God created the world in 6 days. On the 7th day, you do Shabbat. It's worked into Kadmon. But Reb Zusya said, what, let's try it. Wouldn't it be lovely to do Shabbat on another day? So they told their families, they said, you're crazy. And but Monday they start preparing for Shabbat, and they got everything ready, and they made their food, and they got their Shabbos clothes, and they went to the mikvah, the Hassidic practice, and they bought all the good foods for Shabbat. And Friday night they started to pray and do Kabbalat Shabbat, and they found that their prayers were just rising as the prayers had never gone up before, and there was just such a wonderful feeling, and they didn't say anything but continued through the meal and enjoyed and the food just tasted heavenly and delicious, and every item was like it was the best Shabbat on Monday night, and then they got up on a Tuesday, and then on Tuesday morning they said, how is it possible? Well, let's continue. So they got up Tuesday morning and they did all their Shabbos services, and they prayed, and it was just the best Shabbat they'd ever had. Into the afternoon, they went for a walk and they did study. And at the end of Shabbat, they had to admit it was the best Shabbat they'd ever experienced. And so they turned to each other and said, how we did Shabbat on a Tuesday, which first of all is could be considered by some as a sin. And how is this possible? Shabbat is, and so they decided to go see the Maggid of Mezeritch, right? Their teacher. And they traveled to Mezeritch, and Dover said to them, you know what? Shabbat isn't just a day of the week. Shabbat is a state of mind. And there is a place that's always in Shabbat. And whenever you turn your mind to that place and you experience some of it. And part of it is they were living the teachings of their own teachers. But first, let's read the Talmud and see how they weren't just inventing this out of thin air, but this is part of our tradition. They're just bringing some of these questions. So you don't have this, but also you can hear us reading it online. Actually, no, maybe I could. No, but I don't have my email, but no, it's too complicated. Okay. So Al, do you mind reading for us? And online, you'll just have to listen up.
Okay, this is from the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, if only the Jewish people would keep 2 Shabbatot, they would be immediately redeemed. As it is stated, so said God to the eunuchs who will keep my Shabbatot. And it is written, that's from Isaiah, and it is written after that, and I will bring them to my holy mountain and will let them rejoice in my house of prayer.
Right? This idea of the power of Shabbat. The Shabbat isn't just a day that gives you a little bit of peace, but the Shabbat is something much greater than that. Something really powerful that can flow into the world. And this is a lot of the Hasidim did. They would take these ideas, right? Not only that, but it brings Mashiach, right? Even now, you go to Chabad and they say, why do you light the candles? Like if every Jew were to light candles, then the Mashiach would come, right? That's what Chabad says. So the sense of the things have a force in the world, right? And this is in the Talmud. It's like if Jews would just keep 2 Shabbats, bring that power of Shabbat into the world, turn their minds to Shabbat, how that could change the world. And it actually links into a teaching of the Baal Shem Tov on Shabbat. I taught this last Sunday, where he taught that what is Shabbat? That Shabbat is actually one of the names of God, and that because God is ultimate rest, and God is beyond all time, all physicality. God is eternal. God is all things, and so. And when Shabbat comes, God is coming and rest is coming, and that he says that when God created the world, God in 6 days looked at the world, but the world was lifeless. It didn't have any spirit to it. So God came and brought Shabbat. What Shabbat was bringing spirit. God took a deep breath and blew spirit into the world. and into human beings, and then that brought peace, so that brought rest into the world. And so our job is then to bring that spirit and that life by turning to Shabbat. And you don't have to only do it on Shabbat. You can do it any time of the day. You can go to the world of Shabbat. And this is a special blessing that we say, a Bir Kana Mazon. Norma, do you mind reading it for us?
May the merciful one grant us a world that shall be entirely Shabbat and eternal rest. You read it in Hebrew rather than in transliterations.
It's true. It's true. But as part of this, is what we say during the blessing after meals on Shabbat. And so this is a very old prayer. We want the whole world to be in Shabbat. So what does that mean? We want the whole world to be in Shabbat. I want the whole world to be in peace. Yeah, I want the whole world to be in peace, the whole world to feel that. So this is the Hasidim believed that they were working much harder to bring in all of these things, to bring in that peace through their prayer, through their action with each other. Go ahead.
And connected. People will be connected through that. Like, practice two Shabbats, and the Messiah would come, and because everybody's connected, peace and resting. So if God will grant us a world where everybody is connected at all times, everybody can be at rest because you can connect, you understand everybody.
Well,
I guess would be a lack of a better word.
very nice.
And this is more simplified too, like we have one little half a page, where all these others, we had 2, 3, 4 pages.
Yeah.
This is like more humble, more simplified.
Because Reb, also there's not that many teachings of Reb Zusya, so you learn from his stories, from how he lived about
Maybe he found what we're looking for.
he found what we're looking for. Yeah, he definitely found what we were looking for, and he didn't just keep it for himself too. He shared it with others, which is a big, and was willing to take on a little pain.
And
Go ahead, go for it.
sometimes I get hung up.
No worries. Please do.
In the paragraph from the Talmud,
Yeah,
I think, I just want to be sure, because I think there's some punctuation that's missing. Says, so said God to the eunuchs, who will keep my Shabbatot?
yes.
Okay, so God was asking a question, but the eunuchs? I mean, not that I know our teachings in and out, but I don't think I've ever come across eunuchs.
Well, in the book of Esther, there are,
But that was in the royal court, and they weren't Jewish.
This is God speak. Well, in Isaiah, there are moments where God speaks to all those people in society who are considered to be downtrodden. We don't have status with wealth.
Okay, but so this was even in the Jewish society. There were
It wasn't something.
or he was speaking to
I don't know if there was
anybody
some that were
outside.
purposely. Maybe he was talking to people who had an accident or
Okay.
something. He was talking to people who felt like they had nothing. Who didn't have a future or present. Maybe. But it is a verse. The verse from Isaiah does talk about that, and I'm not sure, but I wonder if in the Christian tradition this becomes part of the monastic ideal, right? That God speaks to the people who are spiritual units.
I have this Bible app on my phone, and so I was kind of looking that verse up in Isaiah, and I'm not coming up with eunuchs in particular translation, I'm just got a million translations here. Just pulled up a couple, so it doesn't say eunuchs there, it just says people, for all peoples, sort of thing, in that couple that I looked at, so just.
Okay.
Well, I'll pull up the Hebrew, but I doubt they would have written that if it wasn't. No.
What's the word in Hebrew? Would you?
I mean,
That's the thing with
There's a
translation.
rabbit hole. I want to go down tonight looking up the root of the word Unix and what other words use that today.
yeah, so you see. Yeah. Let's see what Rashi says. Rashi doesn't say anything, but yeah, no, it is.
Okay, sorry to take this down a rabbit hole.
But that's good.
You gave me something to do that.
It is. There could be another class, but
About Unix.
we'll let David show if he wants to on the Monday nights. So, I mean, this and maybe a last story about him is that apparently when Reb Zusya was coming to his last days, the Jose, who was the seer of Lublin, who was one of the next generation of Hassidic leaders, who was a disciple of his brother Reb Elimelech, he came to visit Reb Zusya in his old age, and he saw how much he was suffering, you know, and seeing the Jose crying, his friend Reb Herschel, Leib of Olik, turned to him and he said, "Do you think he is sick because such is his destiny? He has taken suffering upon himself of his own free will." And you know, this in some ways, Reb Elimelech is the one who came up with the theology, but Reb Zusya is the one who lived it in some ways. And this idea, and we saw it the Baal Shem Tov, like the Baal Shem Tov was, you know, going out with the kids when he was a teacher and was about this connection to people and doing anything out of love for other people. And that became a big part of Hasidic thinking, of that open-heartedness and that love, and sharing in a humanity, which and they believe in this idea that, you know, we all do things that are good and bad, and everything is written down, and but that the Rebbe has the spiritual shoulders to take on some of the suffering of other people. And that's a very, very intense idea. But all these stories of Reb Zusya was one of those people who had that power to be able to help people. And whatever it was, he was clearly able to help people who were really going through it and make them feel like they were back in the clear, and not carrying anymore their load. And so when I think of Reb Zusya, I think it shows that what the Maggid and what the Baal Shem Tov were teaching was very powerful and real, and that they were able to transmit it to the next generation. And that's why it became a movement. They weren't just a few people, but that there was something about the way they were living that was the people were drawn to, and the reason that half of Europe became Hasidic within a few generations, because they were so alive and real, and spoke to people where they
Do
were.
we have any people like that around?
They
I
are,
used to
but
think
not,
that
yeah. Schneerson was, you know, they had people see Schneerson in that way. And the, you know, even though Shlomo Carlebach had his drawbacks, but there are stories about him that he was obviously before cell phones, but he used to walk around and he had this big roll of names of all the people he knew around the world. And after his concerts, he'd go around the world and he would have a concert, and then he would go down his list and say, "Oh, I need to call him." And it happened a few times, at least one, where this happened recently, so this is real. You know, there's stories about it. He called someone, and the moment he called that someone, there was a story this one person was just about to take his own life. He was in the midst of, he had a knife in his hand, and suddenly the rabbi called, and so he started talking, and he talked him out of doing it. And there are a few stories like that, and so, you know, he had some of that thing of see that deep humanity and love of people. And, you know, in Shlomo, you know, there were thousands of lost Jewish souls in the 60s, and he helped bring them into a better path and a better way. And I think it could have been even greater, you know, or
Is
something.
his daughter still entertaining?
His daughter, she does singing and she does things, and I think she's been through a lot in her life, and she sees herself a little bit in that role, the beautiful voice, and maybe take on that role of Rebbe. And I think it's good we're talking about it, because this becomes a topic that begins to grow in the next level of the Hassidim, is this idea of the Rebbe and what it means to have teachers. I think post-war there were people, and there's some people, and there might be some of these people who are hidden away and not available to people like us, in kind of rural communities, but it's hard to. But I think one of the teachings that we each can be people like that for people in our lives. We might not have such big shoulders, but we can, for people in our lives, we can help uplift the people we love and connect with people on that level, and try and put our egos aside and connect with people and try and uplift them. But that's a beautiful ideal, and to say that all of our spiritual lives are about connecting to God and about uplifting other people, and that's a pretty deep way to live, and that's possible. So next week I won't be here, but we'll pick up in 2 weeks with Reb Zusya's brother Eli Melech, and see how we'll pick up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.